Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. A great show today. And a first thing to say is today is the 19th anniversary of September 11th. I think many of us remember where we were that day, and it's good to pause and remember what we went through as a nation that day, some almost 20 years ago. It's hard to believe. And as we go through times of crisis again, it's good to reflect on where we've been. We've got a great show today. We do have one news item today that we're going to tell you about. After that, I've got Tom Marten. He's the director of the University of Michigan Coulter program who's with us. And after that, we're going to talk about risk, all the way from extreme sports to COVID and the FDA and medical device development. After that, we've got time for Q&A. But the first thing I want to bring to you is a news item here that has been growing over the last little while. We're going to do a screen share on this one. And this has to do with hand sanitizers. We are used to thinking of hand sanitizers as being a great thing to have available, especially in this time of COVID. And it's true, but the FDA has been having issues. And as you know, many emergency use authorizations were created, which allowed people to get things out there quickly. We heard about a lot of distilleries which went into hand sanitization production, which was great. But here's the most recent in a recall from MedTech, their hand sanitizer alcohol antiseptic, because it's found to contain methanol, and it turns out this is far from the only episode of this. And the FDA has seen a sharp increase in hand sanitizer products that are labeled to contain ethanol, but have tested positive for methanol contamination. And it's even saying the agency is aware of people ingesting hand sanitizer products contaminated with methanol. And this has led to recent adverse events, including blindness, hospitalizations, and death. So this is really, really sad. I want to show you another page here from FDA. FDA urges consumers not to use certain hand sanitizer products. They are listed below. Look at the number, though. This is just one page out of, there are 178 entries. Many are with the same company, but all over the place. Some in Mexico here. There was one in Tennessee. It's a distillery product labeled to contain methanol. That one might just have been a labeling issue, but there are many here that actually did have traces of methanol in them. So public announcement here, if you are using hand sanitizer and it was one of those sort of bottles you just got somewhere, might be good to check the FDA's list here. It's under fda.gov/drugs, drug safety and availability. And good to know about that. We promised you we'd always bring you news about COVID and the EUAs. Much quiet on the emergency use authorization front, but we thought this was worth bringing to you because it still is affecting many of us on a day-to-day basis. And with that, I want to welcome my first guest, who is Tom Marten. Tom is the director of the Coulter program at the University of Michigan. And Tom, it's good to have you with us today.
Great, Gene. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. Tom, we wanted to go through a few different things with you and start with your background, because this is something you've been doing for a long time. And as I understand, it all started with a term paper on vitamin C. Do I have that correct?
That was back in, gosh, that was like back in high school. I've always had an interest in new product planning, development, and actually, I did that as a, vitamin C, which back then was thought of as a potential, Linus Pauling did a lot of work and potential not cure for a common cold, but to help alleviate symptoms of the common cold.
Yeah, and so that got you interested. You're writing things. Did you? I just out of curiosity, did you come down on the same side as Pauling, or did we have some? Do we have some scientific disagreements there?
I was so long ago. I mean,
so from there, walk us through the product development process where you started, because I think one of the things, and you and I have talked before, you had the benefit of learning that process in some very well-respected companies where you weren't just sort of stuck in a little pigeonhole somewhere. You really got to experience across a range of things. Walk us through some of those experiences.
Yeah, thanks. So I've had a really interesting career, took a lot of twists and turns and a little, I don't call it atypical, but not the traditional career pathway. Started out in pharma, actually, and carried the bag, my first job out of college. And so I got the opportunity to launch products, and again, I was in the pharma business. So going through a product launch is a great learning experience, and went through a number of different product launches, and could observe and ask questions. Why did they do what they did in this product? We give you an example. We had an oral antibiotic. It was an oral formulation of an intravenous antibiotic. So the power of a parenteral and a pill. And we talked about using it for pediatric otitis media. Really the focus is more adult, pneumonia. But we talked about they had a pediatric formulation. Challenge is they didn't have an oral, they didn't have a liquid formulation. So if anybody has kids and you try to get a 3-year-old to swallow a pill, it just doesn't happen. So going through just a number of experiences at the time, I worked for Glaxo, who had the #1 drug in the world, which was Zantac. So obviously all the effort went towards Zantac. You look at a $1 billion product versus a $50 million product. Obviously the $1 billion product is going to win, which actually doubled the following year. And so from Glaxo, I was around when there were Glaxo Inc. Now they're known as GlaxoSmithKline. I was around when they first Glaxo Inc. and they merged with Burroughs Wellcome, became Glaxo Wellcome. And at which point I moved from the sales force into their home office in North Carolina, and was in the oncology HIV division, and was involved in market research and had some strategic planning roles in the HIV space. And so in the late 90s, that was a great learning opportunity for developing pharmaceutical products, because we were getting drugs approved with 16-week data, which is unheard of.
Wow.
They use the term accelerated approval. And so it was a good opportunity to see just the interplay with key opinion leaders, working with the medical community. At the time, AIDS was running rampant and there was a lot of despair. And we caught the front end of the ability of all these new antiretroviral medications to provide a huge impact. But think about developing a product strategy where you've got to think about the fact that these drugs aren't used alone, they're used in combination. They're called regimens, combination therapy. And you have to think about the sequence of therapy. So which drugs do you pair together? How do you study them? And there's different sequencing of drugs. So when the first sequence fails, then you want to say, what's your next regimen that you're going to use? And so it was, again, a great opportunity to be at the front end, looking at doing the market research, working with product marketing, key opinion leaders, and developing a strategy, and also a clinical strategy, because you've got to think many years into the future and think, how do we study the drug clinically now? Which regimens do we want to compare, and how do we do this? How do we construct these protocols such that they not only get the drug approved, but they have clinical relevance and commercial relevance, such that you're going to generate enough adequate adoption and uptake.
And it's interesting because I think one of the things we see in the med device space is this question of interaction between devices. We live in a very interconnected world. Electronics are only making it more so. The cloud's only making it more so. The drug industry is a place where people have been used to thinking about interactions between many different systems, and it's almost late breaking to the device space to have to consider all that. Oh yeah, is that handpiece going to work with that device over there? How does this interplay with this EMR or things like that? So that's a part that you were working on early. You got exposed then to a wide cross section of things, and one of the things that I think in discussion I realized talking with you, Tom, is that you got to see the interplay right between product development and the voice of the customer through marketing and other channels. Tell us a little bit about some of those early experiences, because I want to tie that back to some of the things that I know you're doing at Coulter, which I think are really cool. But tell us more about those experiences in your developmental years.
So it was interesting at Glaxo. They brought a big consulting firm in and did a year-long essentially analysis of the company. And one of the key findings they found was that commercial wasn't getting involved in drug development early enough. We use the term throwing it over the fence. So development team gets up to phase 3. Okay, now we call the commercial guys in to put a brand team around this. And oftentimes it was too late. I mean, we had a neuraminidase inhibitor, it's a drug for the flu. And you have to start this within 24 hours of symptoms. Well, people don't go to the doctor until after they're sick for a day. What they should have done is really had a concentrated effort on studying use of the drug in other people in a household, a spouse, child, whomever else, and they probably could have gotten much more uptake. And so we had a drug that was an inhalable drug that had to be put into a capsule, and you had to twist the capsule and inhale it. And another company came up with a pill, an antiviral. And so that obviously took over the market. And so you learn a lot about in the therapeutics world, it's very different than a device world. In the drug world, you've got some degrees of freedom with formulation in terms of how you can, whether it can be given orally versus subcutaneously, injectable. But ultimately, once you either swallow the pill, whether it's injected, infused, or given sublingually, the drug does its stuff, does its thing. Drug works in a body works in a drug, and there's nothing you can do till the next dose. A device is different because you've got to think about designing the device such that it can have functionality, such that a user can adequately use it, so usability. And you think about what that means in terms of all your degrees of freedom from a design standpoint and intended use standpoint. So I think a lot of the learnings for me carried over from the therapeutic space into the medical device space where I really live now with the Coulter program.
And I think that really shows one of the things that I've noticed in our interactions, having seen a little bit of how Coulter works from the inside. In a minute, I want you to walk us through what Coulter is, both nationally and also at U of M, and what your program offerings are, and then finally how people can get involved. But one of the things that surprised me, I know you and I were both at a conference a couple of years ago, I think in Cleveland, and we got to talking, and it became very clear that one of your passions is early interaction of potential partner companies acquiring companies. And that's, if you talk to a VC, they're going to be very big on that kind of a concept. And oftentimes a startup will be moving towards it, trying to get to a point where they can have meaningful interactions. And I thought it was fascinating, Tom, how you're working towards those at one yet stage earlier than that here in a translational program, and it's sort of top of mind for you. And I've been in conversations where you're saying, okay, how are we going to get this positioned in front of somebody? It's front of mind. I imagine that comes directly out of these experiences that you had. But maybe you can, and we'll go into it more in detail later, but maybe you can say a word about kind of your philosophy, because I think a lot of people will say, oh, I'm not ready to approach people like that, or oh, I'm ready in an I-Core sort of way. I can talk to people about the general space and get their feeling about it, but I'm not gonna start offering up problem solutions. I get the impression you have a slightly different take, and it's a very strong core to how you run Coulter. Can you tell us just a little bit about that philosophy?
Yeah, so a little background too for those who aren't familiar with the Coulter program. So we are a translational research partnership program based out of the University of Michigan within the biomedical engineering department. So we are a program where we have a goal of bringing medical innovation into healthcare through a company. And the way the program was set up is set up such that we work in partnership with clinical faculty and engineering faculty in advancing projects to the point of a licensing agreement, either to a startup company who go on to raise venture capital, which is very important for our program, or to a strategic, an existing revenue generating established medical device company. And what's interesting how the program was set up, and I'll go into it in a minute, but we have metrics we have to hit. I think I'm the only guy at the University of Michigan with a sales quota. It's like every 5 years we have a set number of what we call exits, which are licenses to strategics or to startups who go on to raise over $500,000, over $2 million, and over $5 million.
Wow.
And the program originated from the Coulter Foundation, Wallace Coulter, Whenever anybody goes to the doctor's office, gets blood work done, you can thank Wallace Coulter. He invented the Coulter counter, which is a cell separation technique such that they can count cells, and so you can get all your different blood chemistries done. And went on to form the Coulter Corporation. They merged with Beckman, and when he passed away, he bequeathed his entire estate essentially to this trust fund. They created the Coulter Foundation, and they went on to fund different universities and set up these programs across 16 different universities in the US, of which 6 received endowments. The others were getting annual grants. And so an endowment is essentially a large gift. And you can say, well, they can't take it back, but they can fold the program essentially after 5 years if you don't hit our numbers. So we take it seriously. And it's interesting in that when I first heard about this, I said, gosh, it's got to be easy. Michigan's great. It's like, when I first walked the halls of Michigan, I was a consultant and saw all the great, phenomenal research that was being done, the innovation that comes out of U of M. And it's a $1.5 billion research enterprise. I mean, it's just like Candyland. But the reality is that we're really structured at the university at doing basic research and discovery and innovation. But that's very different from development and developing products. Investors, on the other hand, they don't want to invest in science experiments. And I don't mean that in a demeaning way. I mean that from a standpoint of they're not really good at the research side. They frankly don't want to delve too much in the development side. They want to acquire products in the medical device space that are pretty close to launch or FDA approval. And what I quickly realized when I joined the university at the end of 2013 was that this goal they have is an impossibility if we don't advance these projects further down the development pathway. Or we have to find entrepreneurs who are willing to form companies around these ideas and frankly not make any money for a number of years and go on a very, very high risk endeavor for which they may never reap the benefits. Because if anybody close to the medical device space knows that it's a challenging area to raise capital around the device space. And even now, angel investors are looking to invest at the stage where devices are close to what's called 510K clearance. And in Silicon Valley Bank did a study. They do an annual study, and I looked at the results from last year, and the returns from venture investing in 510K devices was 3.6x, and they held their investments about 9 years. Versus biopharmaceuticals return, the average return was 12.5x, and they held it for about 5 years. So you can see venture companies just aren't making a lot of money off these simple 510Ks. They're actually moving more towards the more advanced medical devices, which are called, where they have to go through more rigorous clinical trial testing. It's higher risk devices and called PMAs, where you have to get pre-market authorization, but typically only there's some therapeutic areas that are getting a lot of attention now, like neuroendovascular devices for stroke. So what that means is that we're not in a good space to be in if you want to raise a lot of venture capital financing, or it's very difficult. And it's not likely to happen at a very early stage. And it's hard to get, people willing to quit their day jobs, become CEO and take on some of these opportunities. And we don't have a lot of people who really are skilled at that in this area. And my strategy then became, why aren't we working directly with companies? And so I fall back on my prior market research days, product development days, seeing what happens within companies, how companies work. Because I had other positions where I was head of global business development and head of commercial analysis at Bayer Biological Products. And we did a lot of the due diligence on in-licensing activities, in-licensing opportunities. And so I knew how the game worked from an inside within a company, within a pharma company and within device companies as well, from all the conversations I've had with all my colleagues in the device space, and realized that we should challenge this notion that we can't do this. There's a notion when I came to Michigan that it's really not possible to do a direct license to a big established company. I said, well, why? What do they want? And so that's why we talk early, and I'm very upfront with different groups we work with. If you want to stay in stealth mode, we're probably not the right group to work with. If you don't have intellectual property protection, we're probably not the right group to work with. So you got to have something to hang on to as far as IP. But what I do find is that if you look at the resources we have at the University of Michigan, combine that with resources within a big company, for very little effort, they can provide in-kind services, and we can make it very much worth their effort to collaborate with us. And we've been able to be successful in advancing projects, which have led to some recent licensing agreements over the past couple of years.
That's
I don't know if I
awesome.
fully answered your question, but
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's just it's something that people need to understand, that this is a real strength here, that you guys are going out there. And I think the way you described it to me once was, actually sitting down early stage when the idea is there, and just having the conversation with, I mean, you're doing obviously everything you need to protect it and everything else, but to get out there and have the conversation with the company that could buy it, could license it, could implement it, and getting their read. You wrote a chapter for this Success in Academic Surgery, Innovation and Entrepreneurship, edited by Mark Cohen and Lillian Cow, which you passed on to me. And in that, you're talking about, very, very bluntly, I think it might be the same survey that you had just referenced, some of the costs for 510Ks and PMAs, and the numbers, as you and I know, can be staggering. I think a lot of times people don't know what they don't know, and so it's easy to underestimate, what is this going to take? How many shots on goal is it going to take? But obviously, I think that's part of where you're coming from with this approach, which is really cool. Tell us a little bit more. We do have one question in the chat. I'm going to save that for just a little bit later here, but tell us a little bit more about the structure of Coulter and its programs. What kinds of programs are you offering in Coulter, and where does an idea have to be to fit into those?
so first off, we unfortunately right now are not taking on any non-U of M projects. We are evolving the program to become more of a service-oriented provider, and where we may at some point in the near future start taking on non-U of M projects. So, in the past we were more of a granting organization. We've evolved that now to become more of a collaborative product development group. And so what we like to do is identify projects that they're beyond the whiteboard blue sky stage. So there has to be some level of evidence that the concept is going to work, some premise behind it, some evidence. Usually there's some breadboard bench models that have been developed, bench testing, that we can grasp onto and say, okay, we're not totally de-risking this 100%, but we're going to productize this. And so that's the stage we start out. We also have to have some evidence, and we can talk about it too, a very, very long process before we engage with the team in funding and support in our due diligence process. But there has to be some evidence up front too, and they have to provide a reason why. Why do you think this has commercial viability? And what evidence can you provide us? I mean, even a letter of interest from a strategic, typically they're very valuable to have, and to also give us a sense of patentability and some rough sense of freedom to operate. And frankly, we have to take on high risk projects, and we can't say we're only going to take on projects that have issued patents and freedom to operate established. Well, that's not reasonable. So by default, we have to take on that risk, but we do need to we work very closely with the Office of Technology Transfer at U of M, and very collaborative with them. They do a phenomenal job with the licensing reps who we work with, in terms of, they do fellows reports, and we talk to patent attorneys, and we explore, okay, what elements of this are patentable? How can we develop a patent strategy around this? And very often we work collaboratively with Tech Transfer and the team. We end up filing patents shortly before we actually decide to fund projects. But it's a very concerted effort to make sure that we know what we're getting ourselves into, and we understand the risks before we fund.
And I imagine you take different stages there where you're working through people. You have some specific programs that you guys run. Can you list those off for us?
Sure. So what we do is we have a call for proposals, and we have a triage process. So we have a proposals due in February. Then we have an oversight committee who act more like our board of directors, and they're uh, primarily comprised of folks who are in industry, business development, in different medical device companies, representation from Stryker, J&J, Boston Scientific, Cook Medical, Roche Diagnostics, uh, former executives of different diagnostic companies, device companies, serial entrepreneurs, regulatory strategy, venture capital, and I think only 2 academics on our board. And so we triage down to 6 projects every year. And I do a lot of screening up front too. I want to be upfront with people whether or not it's a likely fit for our program. And then we go through, once the triage process occurs, we cut down to 6, and we form mini product development teams around each of these projects. We take them through a process where we really gut check these, and we do primary market research. We hire an outside firm. We do in-depth interviews with potential key stakeholders. These are one-on-one phone interviews. They're moderated. We pay honoraria. So it's not like I-Corps. I-Corps is a great program. I think I-Corps is a little bit before us. We're doing more concept testing. And we also engage with the company to do regulatory roadmaps. We want to better understand not only the intended use, but also the potential regulatory pathway, because as you well know, the intended use is going to impact the potential risk category. And we'll do competitive landscape assessments. We put together mentors, teams who typically business development or investors with relevant interest in a particular therapeutic area or related to the device or the potential project and vision product at hand. And we work with the teams on a weekly basis and work towards understanding where are the gaps in a market. How compelling is this value proposition? Would anybody want to pay for it? Could this get adoption, uptake, and use at a level that would be required to be a sustainable product? Or is there a strategic out there who could be interested? And along the way, even early on before we fund, we very often will reach out to companies. We had one example. We had a project that's related to sternal closure. Patient who had open heart surgery, you've got to have closure devices that close the sternum. And we engaged with the leading company one of the leading companies in this space. In fact, we had 2 people within that company as mentors, and I'm not naming names here. And we had a number of conversations with their business development group, even their product development teams, and they provided a tremendous level of insights as far as interest. And we started working back and forth in terms of understanding what could we do at the University of Michigan to make this more compelling for them? Because we will engage in early stage product development. We're starting to design these under really clarified product specification requirements, develop design controls, design input, design specification requirements, do risk assessments, all the stuff I know, Gene, you guys engage in, we've talked about in the past. And specifically, what would they want to see? What verification studies? It's amazing when you talk to a company, we see teams that want to do, extravagant animal studies. And they said, we've talked to companies, I remember for one device, and they said, no, don't do that. Because there's no control for an animal study. Use a simulation model because we can, compare across 5 different other devices in this space, and we've got a control for the actual experimental design. You show me an animal data, I don't know how to interpret it. And so you get input like this. And so you realize if you spend $50,000 on a large animal study, that it may not be relevant to get to our goal of an exit. So what is meaningful? What do we need to do? And we're not going to take it all the way through to 510K. So how do we create a handoff point? Because companies think from a systems engineering standpoint, right? And it's got to fit into their system. And that's our goal, is to get to that point. And if you start, identify a partner, you start dancing early, it makes it that much easier to step into a formal agreement. And they've been, especially if they've been working with us over the past however many months or years leading up to that point.
You know, I think you put your finger on a way of phrasing it that was what I couldn't quite grasp, but what I've heard from you at multiple points. It was that question of going to a company and saying, what would make this interesting for you? And I think to a lot of people, if we imagine those words coming out of our own mouth, we think that that's overreaching or stage inappropriate or something. And I think it's good for us to hear that right here, that no, you can actually go. And as long as you're not saying, this thing's ready for prime time, I've got my, I'll have my 510K in a month kind of a thing. If you're really communicating stage appropriateness of where the technology is, people are willing to talk, they're willing to listen, they're willing to contribute, because what they're doing is they're creating new pipelines for themselves. It actually is a win-win, even though you're not done with product development at that point. I think that's just really great for the audience to hear, because I know so many of us, we do have an instinct that says, I'm not ready to approach that person. And there may be reasons why you are or aren't, but I love this sort of stage appropriate going alongside and saying, here's where we are, here's what we're thinking about, here's what we're considering, what would make this more attractive to you? It's not a hard sell, it's a welcoming to come in and be part of the discussion, which I think is just a really cool feature of what you guys are doing.
And even for folks out there who are in the startup world, I mean, even a lot of work towards, a lot of focus I've noticed in the ecosystem and approaching venture capital, but I encourage you still to reach out to companies, because they're not going to steal your product. I mean, there's such a fear about that. I mean, make sure you have a patent filed. Once you get through pretty early on, they'll sign an NDA. Keep in mind the patent laws are such that if a company egregiously infringes, a judge can award treble damage, which is triple the damage amount. It happened to Zimmer. They launched a pulse lavage device that was eerily similar to Stryker's. So much so that Stryker sued them, and judge awarded treble damages. So $70 million award turned to a $210 million award.
Wow.
So a company has to think about this. They want to go down that road or not. And their technique, I mean, is it a risk? Well, sooner or later, they're going to find out about your device and your product, your patent. Your application is going to publish at some point. So you better find out sooner rather than later. And they may point, hey, you're really close to looking like this guy's product, this company's product. You learn a lot when you talk to companies, and you got to know the process. And there's a pretty, I'd say there's some fairly established etiquette on how to do this. But if you get in front of the right people, teams may find they get incredible insights and advice that they otherwise would never have gotten.
We've known any number of physician innovators who have come to us, and maybe they've been free with their information and free with their IP, and some have been burned before on, I got very close with this company and the company burned me. Obviously, you're not talking about a sort of a willy-nilly, no regard for IP, like you said. Make sure you've got your patent filed, and make sure you've done things according to make sure you take the time to find out what protocols are that people follow, but then charge in and have the conversations.
Yeah. You don't always have to share everything, but if you don't share anything, people can't respond.
Yeah, no, that's well said. We've got a question here from Olaf, frequent listener of the show and contributor. He says, hello, Tom. Thank you for taking the time and explaining innovation and business product strategies future in the U of M context. I did not quite get, but found super interesting, the exit part, where you mentioned 0.5 million, 2 million, $5 million business opportunities. Would you explain more? How do you've got metrics there that you mentioned. Can you say any more about how those work? Because that I think is unique to your
again,
program.
those are just unique to our program. The Coulter Foundation, when they awarded the endowment to the university, we had to apply for it and go through a long process to get the endowment. It was before my time. I don't know if anybody remembers Jim O'Connell, who was here back then, was heavily involved in the process. He's now University of Florida. But to get the endowment is $20 million, so $10 million from foundation, $10 million match from U of M. We had to agree to run the program a certain way and adopt these these metrics. They set the metrics. So there's nothing magic about them. They just arbitrarily, I don't know how they came up with the numbers. They just came up with these numbers. It's almost like a Chinese menu. We have to either get, 2 license agreements and 1 $5 million raise, and then 3 $2 million raises versus, 3 or 4 licenses in industry, and, no 5 million raises, but more 2 million raises. So it's a mix, but I wouldn't have folks worry about that. It's unique to our program. But the gist in setting this up was that just forming a startup was not enough. It's not considered a win. They considered it a win when other people put their money in other than the US government. So an SBIR grant wasn't considered a win or an exit for us. It was when a venture capital firm, private money, essentially professional money, goes in and they do their due diligence. So it's obviously very different from what a venture capitalist would consider as an exit. They define it very differently, obviously. So the other things I mentioned, 3.x return for a 510K, that's venture capital money in. They get 3.6x out, but hold the asset for 9 years on average.
Great. Yeah, that's a good answer. But again, yeah, it's not U of M wide. That's specific to the Coulter program as a national program instantiated here at U of M. I want to give the audience an opportunity. If you've got a question for Tom, feel free to raise your hand here in Zoom. We'd love to hear from you if you've got any questions about the Coulter program or his experience in pharma development. Our good friend Ken Spencer is live with us. Ken, are you there?
Good to see you. Great presentation. Question for you. Those of us who've been around forever remember when Coulter first started, it was like a grant program. And now you've made a pretty significant shift. And so when you get triage down to the 6 projects you're going to work with, what exactly do those 6 projects get? Is it funding? Is it service help? Or is it a combination of both? What is that?
Combination of both. So we'll invest typically on average up to $15,000 per project. We'll do primary market research, typically do about 6 to 8 to 10 interviews. We pay honoraria. We'll do regulatory roadmap with a group called MethodSense out of North Carolina. We'll do competitive landscape assessment. We've worked with a couple different companies helping out on that. Plus we do our own due diligence internally. I've got a stable of a great group of people who are willing to spend their time working with us on this, again, from different companies. I'm going to give an example. One diagnostic project we worked on in C3I, we had the chief medical officer from Roche Diagnostics. We had a division head from Abbott Diagnostics. We had vice president, a guy who was with the diagnostic company formerly with Athena Diagnostics, someone who's brought 2 companion diagnostics to market, chief operating officer of another local company doing a diagnostic. So you put a team around these projects and you've got a think tank and saying, here's what we found, here's what we've learned, what do you guys think? I mean, bringing to bear all the issues that we're going to face, whether it be market, product planning and development, commercial, insights. And so this goes on, it's an 8-week program. And, we're fortunate these mentors are volunteering their time. They'll give us an hour a week, plus all the time that we put in. And, the culmination is a pretty extensive due diligence report that we use with our oversight committee to help us decide whether or not to fund, and also helps the team out to provide guidance and direction for their efforts, even if they're not funded.
Great question. Great answer. Thanks, Ken. Appreciate that. Any other questions for Tom? Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up, but we appreciate those too. Tom, anything else you want to leave us with before we go? We certainly appreciate your coming on, and as I know you mentioned, over time you have other goals for the program. We'd love to have you back on as things move and shift and if there's anything you want to mention to the community. But any parting words for us today and for the community that comes together to work on the delivery of healthcare and devices and therapeutics and other things?
Yeah, I think just in general, this is a phenomenal ecosystem. I know we're primarily focused on this column imagining on the Southeast Michigan area. But I mean, if you look at Michigan overall, I mean, you got U of M, and then out towards Kalamazoo, Stryker. There's a number of different companies who are part of the development chain of medical devices. I know Keystone, UFP we've worked with. There's a number of emerging device companies, you know, C2DX, and other, if Kevin McLeod's been on it all. And
I
so,
think Kevin's on today, actually. Yep.
is he? Hey, Kevin. And so I think that it's a great for us all to kind of band together and keep that, you know, open lines of communication in terms of supporting each other, because I think that, you know, we can grow as a hub. I think there's a lot of opportunity with devices to grow even further from where we are right now, and hope to be part of it and continue in our efforts as we grow the Coulter program.
Oh, that's great. Well, we appreciate having you on, Tom. Appreciate what you're doing. And if you need any tips for how to reach out when it seems like it's too early and you want some pointers, I'm going to volunteer Tom. I don't know that he's actually got time to do that and all of his busy things, but a great
Happy to talk,
resource.
and thank you again for having me on.
Yeah, we appreciate it, Tom. We'll talk soon, and welcome back anytime. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks.
Well, we're excited about what Tom's doing with the Coulter program. If we can bring it up here, we are going to get our next segment up, and that is about risk. Give us just 1 second to change over here. Well, I want to thank Peter Schutt on our team, who the other day looked at me and said, you got to do a segment on risk. And it shouldn't just be risk with respect to 14971, which we will get to at the end, medical device risk. We need a way to think about risk as a bigger picture thing with all the things going on in the world. We need a holistic vision of risk. So we wanted to start that conversation today. So today we're calling it Risk, Extreme Sports, COVID, and the FDA, just to get ourselves in all sorts of interesting topics. But first, I want to share with you a bit of personal interest that I have. And this is something that I like to do in my spare time. I'm going to share two things with you that I like to do. The first is this. This was this last summer, somewhere in West Michigan, pulling somewhere between 2 and 4 Gs in a paraglider, entering an asymmetric spiral. You're out sideways of your wing, that's about 3 Gs right there, and pulling out about 1,500 feet above the ground. That's something that I enjoy doing, maybe not for everybody, but powered paragliding and maneuvers courses at that. Here's something else I enjoy doing, and that's working towards FDA readiness with clients. And there is a granting letter or a clearance letter from FDA for a 510K that we got. Now, I'm going to ask you this. What do these two things have in common? And has Gene gone completely off his rocker? Well, that may be, but what these both have in common, something like an extreme sport like powered paragliding, nose down spirals, and the process of getting an FDA clearance and working towards that, they do have something very important in common, and that is the assessment of benefit and risk. Or another way of saying it, why safety is such a complex concept. And of course, this goes to our personal lives, it goes to our public lives, it goes to things like what we do in our spare time, it goes to public policy, it goes to what we expect of the FDA during emergencies like COVID, and during the normal run-of-the-mill, we're doing 510Ks and de novos and everything else. And of course, our company develops devices and develops the technology and the documentation for those submissions and does those submissions. But how do we think about this, and how do we take a step back and think about safety and risk? Well, let me ask you this question. Is an activity safe if you have a 1 in 5 chance of dying from it? How about 1 in 50 chance of dying from it? How about 1 in 100 or 1 in 500? or 1 in 10,000, or 1 in 100,000? Which of those would you call safe? And a lot of us will start thinking, well, maybe 1 in 5, no, that's not safe, and 1 in 50, no, it's not safe. And maybe by the time we get up to 1 in 10,000, we'd say, yeah, that's safe. I'd call that safe. Or maybe it's 1 in 100,000. But really, the answer is this isn't enough information. Nobody knows. Nobody knows which of those is safe. So I want you to consider some of these risks, some of the actuals behind some of those numbers you just saw. You have a 1 in 4 chance of dying if you're put on a ventilator because of COVID. Now, a few months ago, we thought that number was higher. We thought it was closer to 90%, but we're starting to get enough information that it's probably a 25% chance of death if you get placed on a ventilator based on COVID. I want you to take all these numbers with a grain of salt. They're based on the best information we could get. We're not trying to make any big points about it, but that's probably a 1 in 4 chance of dying if you get put on a ventilator. Would you want to be put on a ventilator if you had COVID and it was indicated that you might need ventilation to survive? Yeah, I'd want them to take that risk with me, even though that's the highest risk we have on this page. And yet, it's one that I would want to take. You got a lifetime chance of 1 in 60 dying from base jumping. Now, the numbers vary, and there may be some base jumpers listening, so I don't want to get into the numbers too deep, anywhere from 1 in 60 to 1 in 2,000 lifetime risk. A lot of us would say, oh, that's too much risk. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't jump off of something with 1 chance to live. And yet, in some sense, that's less risky than what we just looked at. You actually have a 1 in 106 chance of dying in a car accident over your life. That's a lot higher than I thought it was before I looked into the numbers. And yet, that's something that most of us do every single day. It's a 1 in 541 chance of dying as a pedestrian. And yet, many of us decide that getting out for a walk is pretty important for our health. You have a 1 in 10,000 chance of dying from canoeing during your lifetime. Now, I assume all of these mean that you are actually partaking in the activity as a consequence to this risk. But it's interesting because apparently it's not quite as risky as we might otherwise think. And you have a 1 in 101,000 chance of dying from that one skydive you were thinking of taking this weekend. And maybe we're putting off because you thought it might be too risky. Well, as a one-time event, that's actually not a very high probability. But here's the thing that sort of wraps it all up. Here we are all living our lives. We have a 1 in 6 chance of dying from heart disease. And guess what tends to exacerbate those kinds of problems? Not getting out and getting enough activity, not doing enough things for our bodies, and yet that is a risk that we have of dying. So if we get out, we've got a risk. If we stay in, we've got a risk. We've got all these risks associated with life. Now, what's missing from this? The astute among you will say, you had missed a few things there, Gene, and you're absolutely right. There are a few things missing from those numbers before. One is a comparable basis, a basis per person, per mile, per year, per lifetime, per session, like per activity, maybe per 100,000 people. We could compare on all sorts of bases, but some bases will be more appropriate and some will be less appropriate, and it makes different types of risks very hard to compare with one another. The other part is quantification of risk. Death isn't the only thing we care about. Injuries of other sorts matter too. And risk is quantified generally as severity, how bad is the thing that could happen to you, versus times the probability of occurrence. And sometimes for certain risk analyses, we add in the detectability of that event. So you have to start to quantify the risk. It's not all just a binary did you die risk, it's injury and other conditions. But it really comes back to this idea of safety. And to quote my friend Inigo Montoya, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Now, the feeling of safety is very real. We either feel safe or we don't. But the abstract idea of safety as this standalone concept that means absolute freedom from risk, it's not a very helpful concept. When we think about safety, we have to think about it in the context of benefit risk. Because, and with apologies to William Golden, life is risk. Anyone who says differently is selling something. Inconceivable, you say? Well, let's put it another way. Risk quantification without consideration of benefit, it's an incomplete picture of safety. Any complete picture of safety in life with a medical device, whatever the topic is, if you don't consider the risk and the benefit, you've got an incomplete picture. So let's talk about benefit for just a minute. Sometimes we call this, especially in the sports world, risk versus reward. The question is, there's a risk. Is it worth taking the risk? What do we get by taking the risk? What's the alternative if we don't take the risk? What new problems could occur if we do take the risk? Now, if I offered any one of you a 25% chance of being maimed and said, do you want it? I hope your next question for me would be, well, why do I need to take that risk? What am I going to get out of it? What's the thing that I'm getting in return for taking this risk? And that's really the benefit question that you would instinctively ask, and it's tremendously important. Now, we can think about benefit risk in any of a number of domains. In extreme sports, it's usually a personal decision. We're getting endorphins, we're getting adrenaline, we're getting adventure, and sometimes at the risk of death or dismemberment. With the emergency use authorizations that we were all talking about a few months ago so heavily, and just remembered today with the supposedly ethanol hand sanitizers that in many cases, 178 cases, have the potential for methanol contamination, there's a public and corporate benefit to getting that stuff out there early, and that means rapid access to needed supplies, lives saved. But there's also a risk, and that's the increased chance of complications from lack of scrutiny. I really doubt we see that much methanol contamination in the US, except under these EUAs. But we made the determination that it's worth taking the risk to get these out there to people, and now some backtracking has to happen to clean that up. We saw that with the antibody tests. The antibody tests were put out with an understanding of efficacy. Many of them have been pulled back because that the sensitivity and specificity, positive predictive value and negative predictive value weren't achieved. And that's what you have to do to mitigate that extra risk. You've got to be willing to come back and check on it and pull it back. In contrast to traditional clearances, like 510Ks and de novos, there's public and corporate benefit, gives you access to needed supplies, lives saved, lives bettered, and there's less tolerance for risk than there would be under an emergency use authorization. That's why the EUA is there. So in the world of medical devices specifically, of course, the standard for risk assessment is 14971. It's ubiquitous. It's harmonized with many other standards, including the 60601 family of electrical and other safety standards for medical devices. 14971 provides a process flow for considering and documenting the risks to the user and the patient. And as a device being marketed to the public, while you can argue about risk levels, it's important that you and the FDA ultimately agree on the benefit risk assessment of a device. Many companies will make the mistake of doing all the analysis of risk, but never come to the determination that the benefit of using the device outweighs the risks. And that's an important point to come down to, because you're doing that in the public interest and saying, yep, there's risks associated with our device. There's no shame in saying that there are. Here's the benefits of using our device, and we've been able to deal with the risks in a way that works for public health. Here's a process flow for 14971. It starts with risk analysis, then risk evaluation. Those are both part of what we call risk assessment. After that is risk control. How are you going to control the risks that you have identified and do exist? After you've controlled those, you have to evaluate what your overall risk remaining is, report on it, and then be willing to track the risk profile of the device as you go through the product life cycle. This whole thing is called risk management. And just one more word about risk controls. The priority order for these is inherent safety by design. In other words, if you can make the thing inherently safe, do it. After that, if you can put something on that's a protective measure, great, that's the next best thing. And lastly, information for safety. Labeling only goes so far because, as we know, not many people read the labels. So that's a little bit of an overview of risk benefit from the perspective all the way from extreme sports through COVID, through the EUAs, and to medical devices in everyday use. Now, we didn't touch on the public health aspects of COVID. That's something we're still going to leave to the viewer to wrestle through looking at the emerging data. But I did want to bring these principles out because they touch on every aspect of our lives. When you go out there and you say, what am I going to do, and is it worth the risk? Ask, what's the benefit? What am I going to get from this? And that's an important process to get into, especially if you're in the world of medical device development like we are. And if you have any questions about this process, feel free to reach out either after this on the recording or right now if you're listening live. Take your questions on risk assessment, risk management, and risk mitigation. Feel free to raise a hand if you have a question on any of those topics. Olaf, you're live.
I couldn't resist. This is such a fascinating topic of risk and benefit risks and so forth. So you gave some of these examples from when is it considered safe? At a 1 to 5 risk, 1 to 100,000, whatever. And so I mean, one example I'm thinking of is and it kind of gave me the idea that what you discussed actually has a lot to do with game theory, right? Like, hey, what am I willing to pay for, which is kind of the risk part, the downside part, right? Am I willing to give my little finger if I can? Yeah. I mean, let me give a specific, very, very simple example, right? So if you have a group of people and there's somebody with like a revolver and ready to play Russian roulette, right? So let's say you have a 1 in 6 chance, essentially, if it's a normal revolver with 6 chambers and you have 1 bullet in there. They'd be like, okay, all right, so we're going to spin this revolver, and then who's willing to try to put this to their head? Or let's be less brutal. Let's say just point it at their thigh, maybe their leg, right? And say like, okay, pull the trigger, and if I give you $20, $100, $1,000, and so how would that be answered, right? And then I think it's probably, if I'm thinking about this more myself, it really depends on also other additional circumstances, right? So somebody who has a lot of money already is like, no way, I'm not going to do that because then I can't do power paragliding for half a year. But somebody who lives, off unemployment checks or so is saying like, well, for $1,000, I would probably do it, because there's no certainty that I'm going to get shot, but there's like a pretty good chance that I don't get shot. So
it's an interesting question, yes, and we want to make sure we're not advising playing this game under any circumstances, but it's a fascinating question, Olaf, and I think you actually saw that in some of what Tom brought out earlier about the PMAs versus the 510Ks, and the point that he made was that the 510Ks, which are kind of Me Too things and are often limited by the claims of a 510K, investors are finding that they may not be quite as valuable as something that's like a de novo or a PMA. Now the cost up front is higher, the risk is in some sense higher, but so is the payoff.
Yeah.
You've also, in your example, you give a personal example, right, where it's one person's decision about their thing, but what we're dealing with medical devices is I can't market something to the public without going through the FDA. They're overseeing public health. And one of the things, it's a very perceptive question, because one of the things that comes up is what is my default today?
Right.
If I have a status quo that's working, and a lot of times we do have status quos that are, nominally working.
Yeah.
What's the adoption of that? What's it going to take to get adoption? What new challenges come up? What are we going to put people through in bringing this? And so while in your mind it's easy to say, this is a great idea, we should do it. Oh yeah, there's some increased risk. By the time society piles on and says, hey, here's what we're already doing, we're not that comfortable making this change. You do have that added layer of the public benefit that comes into it.
Right. I mean, if I may add a very current and critical and growingly critical question, would be, if you're a competent investor, or even if you're like Tom was talking about, think about, okay, so there is a vaccine or something being developed right now together with help from University of Michigan. Now they want to find somebody who scales this up. This might, for example, be influenced by a discussion, evaluation of like, well, how many people are actually going to get vaccinated? Because there's a surprisingly large number of people, right? Fortunately not the majority, but there's still a large number of people who are just adamantly opposed to vaccines. And then there are all sorts of other rumors on the internet about, what they really are, and which are unreasonable and unfounded. But, the question is like, how many people then are willing to take the risk, aside from the whole risk of the success of developing a good vaccine, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, these are valid questions, and it becomes very complex. And one of the things we have the benefit of in medical devices versus emerging public health is in emerging public health, we often don't have good data to go on because it's emerging. In medical devices, we actually have a mandate to consider previous devices, especially if you're a company releasing your second or third device. You're mandated to go back and look at information from the earlier ones, and you're certainly encouraged to look at other devices like yours and to bring in information for safety from those. So it is a very different playing field in both those cases. But it's a great question, Olaf. Always appreciate your questions, sir, and it's great to hear from you today.
Yeah, thanks.
In just a minute, I'm going to bring our friend Diane Bouis on. She has an announcement, and of course, in the Q&A session, we always like to welcome people who have announcements and things to say. I do have one more question here from Jeff Schultz. He says FMEA isn't mandated by ISO 13485, and maybe, I don't know if you mean 1345 or 14971, but you're correct. FMEA is not the only way to do things. Failure mode and effects analysis is one tool that you can use to analyze and manage risk. And he says, do you recommend FMEA to all medical device suppliers? Are you familiar with the new VDA AIAG FMEA format? People using FMEA may want to consider the new format. We haven't looked at that, Jeff. I might follow up with you afterwards to find out more about that. We haven't seen that necessarily out of the 14971 standard. But as you mentioned, FMEA isn't the only way to do it. I've had to mention to many people, we say risk analysis, and they say, oh, you mean FMEA? And the answer is no. It could be failure mode and effects analysis. It could be a fault tree analysis. It could be a basic hazards analysis. There's any number of valid ways to get your hands around the risk that your device has. And something that it's often appropriate to use FMEA, but certainly not the only or always way to go about it. So great. With that, I don't see any more questions on risk. I do want to welcome our friend Diane Bouis on. Diane, are you live with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. It's great to hear your voice. I don't know if you're in a position to share video. I've made your video live too. You're welcome to join us here.
Oh, there we go. I had a brief internet glitch. Apologies for that. There we go. Crazy background.
Wow, I love the background. That's awesome.
you gotta lift yourself up, right? But I wanted to quickly come on. Really appreciate the opportunity. It's a tough call to go after a really good discussion, but there are a ton of really exciting events going on in the ecosystem in the coming weeks. And I wanted to make sure to spread the word. Some are University of Michigan. We're celebrating Celebrate Invention. And I'm going to pop a whole bunch of links in the chat. But there are also other ecosystem events that are not part of University of Michigan. And I consider myself an ecosystem connector. So I will put all of them there. So first, Accelerate Health. And that might be one that is really interesting to a bunch of people. It's a healthcare accelerator, and they're having their demo day next Wednesday night. Medical devices, some healthcare IT, just really great. I've been a mentor with this cohort, and so I know they've made great progress. So Accelerate Health demo day is next Wednesday. Then Celebrate Invention is an entire week that is the University of Michigan's Tech Transfer Office, where I sit. Celebration of innovation with faculty as well as startups. Lots of events. One that I like to point out is Serena Glover's Fundraising 101. But you should definitely check out the webpage. There is tons of good stuff. And this coincides in time with A2 Tech 360 by Ann Arbor Spark. Lots of really good startup events, some healthcare related, some not. And the one that I personally got involved in collaboration with Spark and in collaboration with MIHQ is Tech on the Edge. And the reason it's called Tech on the Edge is obviously splitting edge technology, but mostly the types of companies that people on this call are involved with are often companies that require labs. We're talking STEM-based companies that are not often your typical IT company downtown. So they're on the edge of town. This year, Tech on the Edge will be virtual, just like everything else. But it should be a good turnout, and I want to make sure to put it on people's radar. Thanks for giving me that opportunity to
Diane, thank you. Thank you for being part of the process of educating people about what's going on in the community. You wouldn't be the one to say it, but I got to ask you just to put in the 30-second plug for what you do with tech transfer and what your particular segment is. Please just tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks for giving me that opportunity too. So I run the Venture Accelerator at University of Michigan Tech Transfer. And so usually when I meet people for the first time, I characterize that as landlord and mother hen to 20 startups, because that describes the role quite well. Landlord is I have labs and offices for U of M spinouts. But mother hen is I am a resource and a connector to the ecosystem. That's why I show up at events, because in order for our startups to thrive, the ecosystem needs to thrive. And that is what you do. And that is what Tom does. And that's what everybody on this call does. And so I am in many ways a connection to other people, just like you are. And so the first people I serve are University of Michigan spinouts, but I am very thankful for having leadership who understands that you cannot narrow-mindedly just service the people who are right in front of you. We're building and growing an ecosystem, and our startups do well when all startups do well.
So true, so true. And great spaces you've got up there, and just a phenomenal resource connecting people. Diane, it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Great talking with you too. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for popping in. I'll give another little minute here for announcements. We've got any number of people on the call who would either like to hear or might have some things that they can say in different connecting capacities. So if you know of any other events or endeavors that your company's part of, I do have here. I'm going to see if he wants to come live. Scrolling up. There he is, Joe Perot. You're on live. Can you hear us? You're muted still. We're going to see if Joe makes it on here. Okay, we've got a technical issue there, but Joe did type something in here, and I just want to read it out. They have a company in Grand Haven, Michigan, Blue Earth, 100% plant-based hand sanitizer, blueearthco.com. So not a recommendation, but a communication there from Joe Perot, who I know has been on the call a number of times. You can go check out what they're doing there. And I guess if hand sanitizers are getting pulled off the market, it's probably good to have some new ones coming in. So we appreciate that, Joe. Diane's put her contact information there. I'm going to give about another 30 seconds in case anyone has any other announcements you want to make. I appreciate Diane for popping on there. Want to give a shout out to all of our friends from the west side of the state tuning in today as well. And with that, I want to thank you all for being part of this, the 25th episode. And it's just great to have you here. Looking forward to next week. It's going to be a really fun week next week. And hope you all have a great week between now and then. Be well.